My name is Jude Sannith. I'm 31 years old, and I'm a television journalist based in Chennai, working for a channel called CNBC TV 18. As part of my career, I cover stories around business, politics, entrepreneurship, startups, covering major sectors much like automobiles, manufacturing, technology, and even entertainment from time to time. My career sees me travel a whole lot, although I'm based largely in this city. In fact, I cover more stories from South India and encompass a lot of topics, most of which I just mentioned. It's great to be here on Inspiring Young Minds, largely because it feels like a homecoming of sorts. In fact, I studied a little over 25 years ago at this very campus, what is now called Don Bosco School of Excellence. Back then, this was part of the Don Bosco Matriculation Higher Secondary School. I had my formative years, my early childhood, and most of my time growing up spent on this very campus. So, speaking to you young minds here, coming back here pretty much feels like coming back home. My childhood was interesting. That's the only term I can use to describe it, because I studied for all of my life, from the time I was 4 years old till I was 17 years old, from LKG till about grade 12 in Don Bosco. So a large part of the person that I am today, a lot of my achievements, whatever little that I have actually derived from life and this career of mine in journalism that I've pursued for over 11 years now, I owe to Don Bosco. In fact, the formative years of my life, my upbringing, the teachers that I dealt with, the principal, the rector, all of whom were part and parcel of my academic life over 25 years ago, played such a significant and huge role in making and molding me to the person that I am today. In fact, most of what I derived from school were values and lessons that I took back in life. And I'm hoping I can help you understand what that was, so that you can also look to actually take that back home with you and help, getting it to play a role in the kind of career or the path that you choose to carve out for yourself. Part and parcel of being a journalist today involves massive support from family, especially parents. I remember when I was very young, in fact, all of just 5 years old, my father bought me a massive library of books that still is at home. In fact, I've outgrown reading most of them, but they still occupy pride of place in my house, because that was such a crucial and critical part of growing up and learning from around me. I would come to school, yes, 8 o'clock school would start, 1:30 school would get over in the primary school, 3:30 would get over in the high school, and yet when I'd go back home, I would leave the books that I learnt in school and read the books that taught me so much about life, about general knowledge, about various subjects: history, geography, life sciences, physics, the way things work, simple experiments, the basics of chemistry, so much that actually helped me understand the world that we live in. In fact, one of my favorite books was the encyclopedia, and it was an encyclopedia that began at A and ended at Z. So I would spend a large part of my childhood actually reading. And I think that's a very important lesson for everyone to take away here. It is so important that you read. It's great to read your school books. You learn them, you perform well, you use what you learn from them in examinations. But beyond school hours, go back home and read. Read as much as you can. So my first lesson, or the first takeaway that maybe you can look to take down or note down, is the fact that what you're good at or what you're not so good at ultimately doesn't quite matter, as long as your passion and as long as your desires are in the right place. And that is something I learned not very early, but much later on in my life. Aside of buying a library of books for me to read, another massive area of support that my family, especially my parents of course, encouraged and provided to me was an ecosystem growing up that helped me nurture my talent and nurture things that I found very interesting. From a very young age, the fact that I would read so much meant that I would enjoy talking about the things that I read. So becoming a public speaker, elocution, debating, all of that became such a crucial part of my extracurricular school life. Sure, while I wasn't great at studies, I enjoyed doing extracurricular activities that mostly involved public speaking. So from a very young age, I knew that this is what I wanted to do, because I had a talent for expressing my thoughts into words and also into writing. I could write well because I read well. And that's exactly why I keep emphasizing on the importance to read in order to make a career that involves expressing yourself either through words, spoken or written. The ecosystem that I had growing up accounted for a large part of who I am today. In fact, back at home, if there was one TV channel that we would all watch, it was the news channel. And even today, there are around 7 or 8 news channels, but back then there were merely 2. There was NDTV and there was a channel called Headlines Today, which is India Today. And we would grow up watching just these 2 news channels simply because we liked to stay aware of what was happening in the world around us. And that ecosystem, that kind of living, of consumption when it came to mass media, played such a stellar role in actually deriving tips, deriving methodologies from that kind of consumption, which helped me carve out a career for myself in journalism. Back during this time, there was no YouTube back here, by the way. This was very early into, it was the late 90s. The internet hadn't quite kicked off in full pace, so we had television and we had books. And yet there was one role model that I always admired, that I always looked up to when it came to saying, you know what, I want to do something like this person. And that was former US President John F. Kennedy, who actually died several years before I was born. And yet the kind of speeches that John F. Kennedy, or JFK as he's more popularly known, made actually resonated within me. If you can, maybe you should go to YouTube today and check out his speech, which says, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country." Just the very elocution in that speech, the kind of voice modulation, the kind of enigma and the kind of inspiration that John F. Kennedy demanded actually resonated within me. I thought to myself, it's important to actually be like John F. Kennedy, to make your voice known, to make it felt, and to actually go about communicating a message to the masses. And although I did not know it back then, this was such a big part of what I would anyway end up doing as a journalist many years into the future. Back during this time, I also used to watch a lot of journalists on national television, many of whom are still journalists today. In fact, I used to enjoy watching the works of Barkha Dutt, who used to be with NDTV back then. Also Srinivasan Jain, who is still an executive editor with NDTV today. I followed most of these television journalists. I read the works of many television journalists, including the likes of T.J.S. George, who used to be a columnist with the New Indian Express, and also Bobbili Vijay Kumar, who used to write sports for the Times of India. A lot of this reading and following of journalists also made them role models for me. And I decided, if I become a career, or I take up a career for myself in journalism, I would like to be like these people. But I must admit, I did not know back then that I would end up becoming a journalist. Becoming a journalist was a complete accident. Like I was saying just a little while ago, back when I was in school, there were just 2 streams that you could pick from: medicine, engineering. Many people felt that you could either do this or that, and choosing one of these 2 paths alone was a sure shot way to success. I fell for that peer pressure. I fell for that pressure from society. My parents never put this pressure on me, but the societal pressure was so much that I became victim to it. When I got to my 11th standard, I chose physics, chemistry, maths, biology. I thought, you know what, I should become an engineer. I should become a genetic engineer. And that's why I picked biology, because I really liked the subject too. And to my credit, I would do really well in biology, but not do so well in chemistry or physics or mathematics. So I thought to myself, you know what, I should really become a genetic engineer. I should take biology. I should do well in science. I should really get into the biomedical or the biotechnological field. It so happened that after school, when my 12th standard marks came, I scored pathetically. I scored only about 76%, and that was really low, or below average when it came to a state board student back then, many of whom would score 90s, 95, 96, 97. So I was quite crestfallen that, my academic exploits did not account for much as far as the examinations were concerned, or when the marks came out. I joined Loyola College soon after that. Thankfully, because I was Catholic, I managed to secure a seat there despite not scoring great marks. I did a BSc in plant biotechnology. In fact, I thought to myself, why not? I did biology in school, let me do biotechnology in college. But I wasn't sure around this time whether I actually wanted to pursue a career in sciences, because I noticed and I knew and I acknowledged that I had some shortcomings, some challenges on the academic front, because as much as I would try, I wouldn't exactly score great marks. And that was a limitation that I knew that I had for myself. And that's another lesson or takeaway that you can take from this. Always know your limitations, also know your talents, because I knew I had a talent for writing. I knew I had a talent for public speaking, but I also knew that I had some academic limitations just because I was aware of the fact that I did not do well in examinations, and it's perfectly okay to be that way as long as you know what your talents are. But I'll tell you how journalism happened. In fact, it's a very interesting story. For a long time in my childhood, for many, many months, in fact, throughout the time that I was a schoolboy, my father would often talk to me about how good it is to be a journalist. My father loved reading, remember? That's why he bought me all those books. I loved reading too. In fact, it was a trait that I inherited from my father. And yet here I was, not even imagining or thinking about the prospect of a career in journalism. Because again, I fell to the pressure that you could either be a doctor or an engineer, and there was nothing else. Journalism happened purely by accident, simply because when I was in college, when I was preparing for an examination called the XAT examination, or ZAT as we'd call it, for admission to a business school, I realized again that I would do really well in my spoken or my verbal ability. I would do really well in logical thinking, the second area of marking, but I would not exactly do well as far as quantitative ability or mathematics is concerned. And that again was a limitation that I got to know and acknowledged well into my college life. It just so happened that during this time, a friend of mine said that she knew the editor of the Times of India's supplements. Now, a supplement is a small newspaper. You know, when you get the newspaper at home, what lies inside the newspaper, the smaller newspapers, there's usually one on education, there's sometimes one on cinema, there's another one that talks about features, about tips for the home. The smaller papers within the main newspaper that you get at home, those are called supplements. So the editor of the supplements division of the Times of India, and this was the year 2009, actually needed somebody to help them write content, stories, columns for the newspaper when it was and continues to be in circulation. And the person who spoke to me, a friend of mine, knew that I would write well and speak well. Remember, I was a 19-year-old here. I was in my second year of college in Loyola College, studying biotechnology. And I said, why not? Let me give it a shot. If they need someone to write, I can write. And on November 14th, 2009, I went on my first assignment as a part-time newspaper reporter. Remember, I was still in college. I remember finishing off my class. This was a day when it was raining and pouring, and I took a share auto from my college campus and made it all the way near Express Avenue to the Taj Clubhouse Hotel, where I was going to do my first ever assignment. And it was extremely exciting. Because remember, this is a world that I did not know about. I knew that journalism was something that I was interested in, but never in my wildest dreams I actually imagined I would do it. And I think that moment where I actually went out and covered my first ever story was such an amazing moment for me, because it made all the difference to the way I viewed the world around me, and I thought about what could possibly be a career for myself. And I use the word possibly because till date, I can tell you, I never imagined even then that I would make it a career for myself. It was raining cats and dogs. I went, I covered the story, I filed the story, I sent the story, it got published the next day, and I earned my first ever paycheck, which was a check of 450 rupees for that one story that I did back in 2009. It was a great time because I was in college and this was great pocket money. And I still never thought I could be a journalist. I was still going about thinking I would give my ZAT examination, I would get an MBA, and I would join the corporate world. How wrong I was, because merely the very next year, I failed my ZAT examination. I scored pathetically in mathematics. I did really well in verbal. I scored about 85 percentile. I did really well in logical thinking. I think I scored about 87 percentile there. But my math marks was merely 14 percentile. I think the first ever time I felt like I had actually, that this was reality and I was actually a journalist was on September 9th, 2010, when I walked into the newsroom of the Times of India for the first ever time. Remember, this was after a period of 5 months where I had no job after I graduated from Loyola. This was because, like I said, I had failed my XAT exam and did not have a plan B. During this time, I was writing for the Times of India's supplements division on a freelance basis, getting paychecks of 400 rupees, 500 rupees for every story that I'd write. Again, I did not know even here, that I could actually become a journalist. In fact, the thought occurred to me when, an editor, in fact, the editor that I was working with while doing these part-time or freelance work called me, or rather called the HR person who worked at Times of India, had the HR person call me up and say, hey, you've been writing for us for a while. Do you just want to join the team full-time? And that's when it occurred to me, wow, okay, this is actually happening. I think what actually happened here was the fact that I had such a huge confidence problem. While I knew I could write, while I knew I could speak well, while I grew up watching news, reading the news, reading books, acquiring all this knowledge from various media around me, I never had the confidence to believe that I can achieve and I can do the things that I see people doing around me. And that's another lesson maybe that you'd want to take away from this. Always believe in yourself. It's okay if you perhaps have self-doubt. It's okay to think, you know what, maybe I won't be able to do this. But always step back and think, but what if I can? What if I'm actually good at this? And that is something that occurred to me quite late in my career when I actually thought to myself, you know what, I can do this too. In fact, when I walked into the newsroom of the Times of India supplements division for the first time, I was overwhelmed with a sense of emotion. I remember when I said my prayers, I always say a prayer before I leave my house to go about my day, to go about doing the job that I've been assigned to. And on that day, on September 9th, 2010, when I walked out of my house and I was saying my prayers, I was choked with so much emotion because here I was doing a dream job that I actually never dreamt about in the first place, or dreamt that I could do this job that I was actually doing. Over the course of the next 12 years or 11 years, since it's been that long since I've been a journalist, I have actually made so many memories and have had so many experiences that have only enriched me for the better. The Times of India, of course, was my first job. I spent 2.5 years there before I moved on to a channel that I enjoyed watching growing up. I actually worked for NDTV for a couple of years, the very channel that I grew up watching, which helped me become the kind of journalist that I am today. 2 years later, I began working at CNBC TV 18, the channel that I currently work at, where I've also spent 7 years of my life. And it was during this channel, or working here, where I continue to work, that I actually derived most of my experiences that I hope to share with you. I think one of the biggest experiences, both learning and career-wise, that I take home for myself, that I've learned so much from, was in 2015 when I covered the Chennai floods. The entire city was submerged. I'm sure you remember. I don't know if you do, but if you're probably old enough, you remember how 6 or 7 years ago, the entire city was drowning because we had seen the worst floods in a century. Thankfully, everyone at my place was safe. Our house wasn't quite submerged, and I would spend nearly 17 to 18 hours every day out there covering some of the worst hit places in the city itself. Places like Koturpuram, Saidapet, Porur, even places like Ashoknagar, or for that matter, Jafar Khanpet, near the river area, which actually were submerged, were some of the worst hit places. Seeing firsthand the kind of people suffering in your own city, this city that I've lived in all my life, actually changed me both as a person and a journalist. In fact, I realized that just 3 years later, when I covered the Tuticorin protests that were involving Sterlite Copper, I don't know if you recall, it was just about 3 years ago when around 13 protesters were shot dead in the town of Tuticorin because they were protesting a plant called Sterlite Copper that they felt was engaging in a lot of pollution. I think visiting Tuticorin and covering that story was another watershed moment in my career as a journalist, because I could see firsthand the kind of suffering that people in my own state were experiencing because of an extremely unfortunate incident. And that only reminded me of the lesson that I taught myself just 3 years earlier, that our journalism needs to be done for public good. And if you do go on to become journalists, ensure that your stories make a difference to the life of the people they are about. Now, most people ask me, okay, so how do I become a journalist? What is the magic bullet to actually go about carving a niche for myself in this career? The answer is quite simple. Firstly, ensure that you're interested in it. You know, unlike other jobs, journalism isn't so much about, okay, I want to be a journalist, or I think it's a great idea to be a journalist. Let me go about doing this, this and this, and I will go about becoming a journalist. That's not how the approach is. You can't be a good journalist unless you're driven by a passion to be a good journalist. And that's why a lot of that passion needs to be seeded at a very young age. Like I said, in my case, I enjoyed reading. I enjoyed consumption of mass media. I enjoyed watching videos, listening to speeches, learning about the world around me. I enjoyed reading stories. I still fondly remember reading all about Robinson Crusoe, Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn, The Count of Monte Cristo, The Scarlet Pimpernel. In fact, a number of these books were actually non-detailed lessons in school. And almost immediately, the fact that I was transported to a whole new world that involved capturing someone into telling them a story and inviting them to be a part of this world that you created for them was such a massive influence on the kind of work that I hoped I would do, although I never knew back then that I would do it. So it's important to read, and it's important to be able to talk about what you read, to write about what you read. So very often, after you read a book, after you perhaps watch something that you enjoy, either a movie or a show or just a talk that you enjoyed, try talking about it. Try expressing what you thought about it. Talk to your friends about it. Talk to your parents about it. Write a composition about it. Ensure that what you consume is given an outlet. And that is so important, firstly, to actually go about setting the foundation or the building blocks to think to yourself or to tell yourself, you know what, I can do this more often. I can do this as a career. That is important. Read and write. Watch TV and write. Read and talk about it. Watch TV and talk about it. Hone these two skills. They're very important for you. The skill of writing well and the skill of speaking well. Secondly, it's also important to choose subjects well. Now, when I was in school, I never thought I'd be a journalist, so I picked sciences. If you choose to be a journalist today, either in school or in college, ensure that you pick the kind of subjects that will serve you well. For instance, I don't know if you have too many options in school today, but in college, you could always pick subjects like literature, subjects like visual communication. You could pick a subject like mass communication. You could pick a subject like journalism that will help you take the baby steps or make stepping stones into actually thinking of a career as a journalist. These subjects that I refer to are either BA or BSc courses. You could choose either one. If you want to be a television journalist, it would do well for you to take visual communication or Viscom, because it also talks to you or informs you about the technical aspects of what it takes to be a journalist. If you want to focus, let's say, on newspaper or written journalism, ensure you take a course like, a BA in journalism offered by a few colleges here in Chennai or wherever they are, because they ensure that they teach you all about the very basic aspects of communication, writing, what it's like to write a newspaper story, what it's like to write a script for television. Mass communication is also pretty much on similar lines, talks to you about writing, talks to you about television presentation. It really, really helps you hone your skills, hone your talent into becoming a good journalist. It's also important to choose the right master's program after you finish bachelor's. Of course, I won't talk too much about that because you'll have ample time in college to actually go about making these decisions. But several colleges, several institutes provide you with a good MA or an MSc or even a master's diploma in journalism. In fact, Chennai has the nationally renowned Asian School of Journalism, which in fact makes most of our journalists today, at least the young journalists that you see around you, doing a master's diploma from that institute is a great idea. There are also several other institutes. In fact, Bangalore has the IIJNM, which is of course another journalism school. There's the Indian Institute of Mass Communication in Delhi. These are also great colleges to go and study in once you're done with your bachelor's program. But of course, you can decide all of that when you actually make it to college, do your bachelor's, do 3 years there, and then decide how to go about doing these things. The career opportunities in journalism today aren't exactly booming. I must be honest with you. In fact, there are a number of opportunities available, no doubt, but you're seeing most news channels, you're seeing most news websites, several newspapers actually downsizing or right-sizing the kind of teams that they have at their disposal. So back from 10 years ago, when there would be 20 people on a team, today that same team has all of 8 to 9 people. So numbers are coming down, and this is something I have to be absolutely honest with you about. Why is this happening? Well, it's because technology has improved. A lot of what we could do today was not possible 10 years ago. We can edit stories faster. Automation has helped us generate content better. There are agencies that supply a whole lot of content, therefore reducing the number of journalists required per channel or per website or per newspaper. So newsrooms are becoming smaller thanks to a boom in digital technology. But does that mean that there can be no newsrooms? Not at all, because the fourth pillar of our democracy, journalism, is so important to the way we go about doing things, the kind of outlook we have on the world, and what we want to achieve as a society as a whole. So where can you work? Well, the fact is India has several big names when it comes to journalism. There are names like the Times of India, the Hindu, 2 prominent national newspapers. There are many TV channels, but not all TV channels are great places to work if you want to be a journalist. Remember one thing that I said a little earlier in this talk. Watch TV and decide whether the content or what they're telling you is for public good or not. Check for yourself as to whether that content changes the life of the person it's reporting on, the life of the person watching it. And if the answers to both those questions are yes, then it's a great TV channel. Then it makes for a great news channel. So pick your television media well if it comes to making a decision as to whether or not to join the television channel. There are several websites today that actually go about hiring journalists. You have websites like The Wire. There's a website called The News Minute. There is a website called Scroll.in. There is a website called The Quint. All of this does good journalism. It does great grassroots journalism. It puts reporters on the ground. And these are exciting opportunities that these websites pose if you want to be a journalist today. Television-wise, there's news journalism and there's business journalism. News journalism, there are channels like NDTV, India Today, that actually go about doing news. Business journalism is by channels much like the one I work for, CNBC TV 18. There's another channel called ET Now. So you can pick the kind of journalism that you want to do. There's also sports journalism. There are websites much like Cricinfo, or there are websites much like Sportskeeda. All of these are dedicated purely to coverage of sports. So there are various opportunities, there are various avenues you can go about being a part of depending on the kind of journalism you're interested in, which is also why it's important in your formative years itself, when you are studying in college, hopefully studying a journalism degree, to decide for yourself as to what kind of journalism you want to do. Are you interested in reading or watching, all about police and crime cases? You can be a crime journalist. Do you enjoy watching football? Do you enjoy playing football, playing cricket, playing tennis or badminton? Sports journalism is a great career prospect. It's also something that's very exciting from what I hear, although I'm not much of a sports journalist myself. Parents, if you're watching this, there's just one piece of advice or a feedback that I have for you. It's important to let your children, I still consider myself a child of my parents, even though I'm 31, to actually go about deciding for themselves what they'd like to do. You could have a child who goes about doing what you'd like them to do, but at the cost of their own happiness, because they probably have a vision an idea or a passion for themselves that they might be interested in pursuing. Now, it's important to acknowledge, and I completely agree with you, not everything is economically rewarding. I'm sure getting your child to pursue, a career in software or IT or engineering or medicine might be way more financially rewarding. But will it bring happiness at the end of the day or not? That is a question you might need to ask yourself, and also ask yourself whether you'd like it if your child were working in a career that didn't quite bring him or her happiness. So I think it's important to let your child decide, pursue their careers, think about what they want to do, and help them with allowing them to think for themselves, but being a pillar of support in giving them information or help with regard to, advising them whether this would be rewarding for them or not, and in what sense they can actually succeed or do well for themselves in the path that they might choose. Leave the decision making to them, parents. I think it's very important that your children understand what it's like to make decisions, and make decisions in an informed manner thanks to your intervention. Inform, don't impose. I think that's something really important that parents might need to take for themselves in case their child or your child wants to make a career decision. So being a journalist, great idea, but it involves a lot of watching, a lot of reading, a lot of learning, a lot of speaking, and a lot of writing. And I think if you can do all of this and pick the right courses, I think you're well on your way to actually becoming a successful journalist. And I hope you do all the very best for yourself, do well, and ensure that whatever you do it with full passion and zeal to ensure that you come out successful at the end of the day.